The emotional toll on Clayton and I was very difficult to describe, because you're going to a building every day, every morning, where you're going to be hearing morbid details about your only child's death, and you know that you're kind of counting down the days of whether you're going to walk free forever or be in prison for the rest of your life. And when your spouse is put in prison, so are you. When Clay called, I was at work, and when I answered the phone, the tone of his voice was like an immediate, like something is wrong. And he said, she fell down the stairs. I drove to the hospital, and I remember thinking, I'm not going to get there in time. When they took her into surgery, we, just kind of waited. And I had already been told that they suspected that she wasn't going to make it. And, he just came up to me and he looked at her and he grabbed me by the shoulders and he's like, it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. And I looked at him and I said, maybe they say it's not going to be okay. The first encounter with the law enforcement was at the hospital. Over the next 2 or 3 months, they interrogated various members of the family and of friends. It didn't take very long before I figured out that there was an agenda, and that they were trying to imply that Clayton was somehow at fault. That was really distressing to me, and it was distressing to the whole family because we knew that he wasn't. The really, really distressing thing was that I wanted to know, why she had been so frail, as to have a previous bleed after the kind of fall that she'd taken, and why things didn't add up for me, for her medically, because she had always been ill since she was about 6 or 8 months old. And the police didn't seem to care about any of that. Just about every member of the family tried to communicate to them that, this is not a normal child. This is a child that we've been going through, a neurologist, a physical therapist, a pediatrician, a nutritionist, and everybody trying to help her grow right and to help her develop properly. She's not just your average baby that's meeting all of her milestones and doing all of her things normally. And so many of her doctors had communicated to us, this isn't because of what you're doing, this is because of an underlying condition, and we don't know what it is. When Jocelyn was born, at first it seemed like everything was okay, and then she wasn't developing quickly enough, and she wasn't gaining enough weight, and she didn't have the right kind of muscle mass, and they couldn't explain why she didn't have that, and she started developing neurological symptoms. There was just so much going on. I remember I communicated with her doctors, and I was like, what are the odds that she has a completely different disease than I do, and neither one of us can be diagnosed? And they said it's not, it's probably not true. It's probably whatever is wrong with her is probably connected to you. And he knew, and I knew that I was sick, and we didn't know why. I had to have an answer. I had to get an answer for myself as to what was wrong with her, what was wrong with me, and what all of it had to do with everything that happened. I ended up getting a referral to go down to Mayo Clinic, and I met with a bunch of different doctors on a bunch of different tests and a bunch of different things, and they basically came to the conclusion that I have ehlers-danlos type 3, and ehlers-danlos type 3 is the hypermobility type. The police and the other investigators involved, according to them, it was completely irrelevant. The original charges that Clay was presented with in the indictment were criminally negligent homicide, manslaughter, and murder too. When the original prosecutor presented it, she flatly explained to them they didn't believe that it amounted to a murder charge, but they were willing to do whatever the grand jury wanted to do, and they got them emotionally invested, and they escalated the charges, and then eventually the case was dismissed, and it had to be brought before a second grand jury, and the second grand jury had dramatically less evidence presented to them than the first. There was a large amount of information that had been suppressed. There was a large amount of information that had been falsely presented the first time and was not followed up and presented the second time. There was just a lot less presented to them than was ever presented in the original grand jury. But that prosecutor, which was a new prosecutor, elected to present the three as a menu of options that the state supported, despite their original stance that it didn't amount to it with all of the false evidence before. And now, with even less evidence, they decided to present it as a menu of options. And that's how they carried it through all the way to trial and all the way to conviction. conviction. When we first went into the trial, we, and I would say and the defense agency, had no belief whatsoever that he would be convicted of murder. The evidence, when we were looking at it, did not amount to murder. It never had. Even the prosecution had said that it never had. The judge had specifically laid down a list of subjects that I was not allowed to talk about. She prevented all of Jocelyn's medical professionals from mentioning that there was any kind of potential connective tissue disease or any kind of condition in the family that had been diagnosed. And she also, prevented any mention of it having any relevance related to Jocelyn's actual death. When the prosecutor made his argument throughout the entire opening section of the trial, he basically just sprayed scattershot on the wall about all the various things that could have happened to Jocelyn. They noted at trial and in court that, he was waiting on labs to come back on samples that he had taken, despite not taking samples of anything else. And he did not wait for those lab reports to come back. He just determined it homicide and issued the report the next day. He told the jury he never read my daughter's medical record. He had no interest whatsoever in what actually happened to her body. It didn't matter that we were able to show that it was completely unprofessionally handled. There was a piece of my daughter that showed up in the evidence lab in 2014. And I am supposed to believe that that's her just because somebody randomly found it. And in his testimony, he also told the court that there's probably more pieces of her floating around in the evidence lab in jars somewhere. They might be labeled, they might not. But, they're just out there. The prosecution continually throughout the entire trial and proceedings mischaracterized testimony from the family, tried to paint us as these horrible people that would shield a murderer. And I think that in combination with all the various levels of evidence that were suppressed, that were not allowed to be discussed, just made it so that the jury just saw a hodgepodge of completely biased information. I believe that the jury has no idea what any of the actual evidence ever was. They made their decision to convict him on all 3 counts. The jury was never required to tell me as her mother what they think that my husband did to her. When we came back to the house, it was like that funeral all over again. It felt like they killed her. Because they killed who she was, they killed her memory, they killed her life, they killed her whole story. And every member of the family was just a wreck. The whole family, as hard as you fight and as long as you stay, everyone expects you to walk away. Everyone expects you to just give up on them, and it's like, well, aren't they dead? It's like, no, they're not dead. They're alive. And they still need us. There were 37 letters of support for Clayton, asking for a new trial, asking for a reduced sentence, asking for leniency from family, from friends, from members of the public. And she basically claimed that the community outcry demanded that she sentence him to 40 years. And I am not aware of any letters asking for a harsh punishment. In my mind, she basically confessed that the trial hadn't proven any particular thing had ever happened, but that because there was a conviction of that particular charge, she could sentence him based on that. And there didn't have to be any justification of what anybody actually believed happened.
Something happened to cause this otherwise passive and patient man to kill his daughter. Dr. Turner has no idea what occurred, and neither does the court.